Distressed property transactions are a really, really nice way to make money, but they do come with a lot of risk, and especially distressed properties. Now, distressed properties can be found simply by driving on the road and seeing that a property looks distressed and approaching an owner. Or, for example, going all the way up into a sheriff's auction where you know for certain that this property is distressed. The owner cannot afford to pay anything. The property has actually been allowed to be taken on auction, which isn't ideal because sheriff's auctions often don't fetch as high a price in relation to market value as one would hope. But it's a known fact that they don't. That's why they refer to as forced sales. So when approaching a distressed property, depending on where it is in this journey or in this, this concern, like where things start going wrong, will obviously dictate how you're going to approach it. Obviously, the further in this, the suffering that the owner has, unfortunately, it is the position where you need to really step in there and try and find a way of resolving. But also there is now a better opportunity to actually be able to make the numbers work, because at this juncture, the owner is really trying to avoid it being sold in execution. So the typical things I'd look at is, why is the owner in default? The owner could be in default simply because he lost his job, lives on the property, and now just needs a way out. But there's obvious risks with this. And what we sometimes see is that the owners get cold feet. There might be a situation where they're desperate to sell at a certain point because they're in hot water. But unfortunately, after some time lapses, there's a change of mind or a change of situation, and there's a reluctance, for example, to move out. And then doing the flip becomes very difficult. So be very careful with those scenarios. Even an owner that has just, for example, lost his employment might later become a problem. So you need to be able to deal with that. Now, if you go to, for example, a situation where a property is being rented, and there's an occupant in the property, that's a big red flag, because usually a property would get enough rental income to at least cover its bond, which is one of the biggest priorities. So if there's this massive shortfall, you have to ask, why is there a massive shortfall? Because the shortfall shouldn't be that big. It should be a small shortfall if the tenant's paying and the property is cash flow negative. So again, bad tenants, really, really bad problem. Now, if you're getting into a deal where there's a bad tenant, now remember what you're really getting into. You're not just managing the owner's expectations. You're fighting a battle with somebody that has no intention to move out of this property. So all these things need to be factored in. How do you approach the owner? How do you take transfer of the property? How do you apply for a bond if you can't even get access to the property in order for the bank valuer to do an assessment? There's a whole bunch of little problems here and there that you need to address. So first thing is, make sure that your deal with the owner is in place. Now, what kind of deals can you get into? So for example, your normal OTP, normal offer to purchase, I'm going to give you whatever, 1.3 million Rand. You work out your numbers, figure out what number you want to give, 1.3 million Rand, and you're going to take transfer of the property. How are you going to get the 1.3 million Rand? Maybe it's cash, right? If it's through a bank, bear in mind the bank might want to do a valuation, so you might not be able to get right with that. If you can't get right with that, you can look for the next options. So one popular one that I sometimes work with is installment sale agreements. You pay enough in order to be able to get this debtor back on their feet. So for example, what is enough? It might be the amount that they owe the bank currently. So not the full amount of the bond, just the amount that they fell short with or they're in arrears with. If you can cover that, the bank would probably stop the process, and now you've got a deal with the owner that you can start working on. But again, please be careful. This installment sale agreement has to be registered at the deeds office, because you don't want to sit with this property for the next 5 years and risk a fight with the owner. Last option, and this is a popular one, and this one works really well, is a JV option. So a lot of guys, especially developers, but guys that flip as well, will go to an owner and say, you know what, I've got a deal for you. I'll cover your arrears, right? And I'll even help pay off this on a monthly basis. You let me do certain renovations to the property, I will do the renovations, we'll sell the property, I'll recover my expenses, and we'll go 50-50. Now, why do people do this? Again, it's to avoid a situation where they need to take out a bond to take transfer. So they either do it this way or they do it the installment sale agreement way. In a situation like this, please remember that if there's a tenant on the property, whichever option you choose to take, if there's an unlawful occupier on the property, you have to factor in your holding costs. And anyone that watches this channel will know that evictions aren't necessarily cheap. And especially if they're opposed, they could actually be expensive and they could take long. So if a normal unopposed eviction can take, say, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months as an example, depending on what court, it could take even longer. Imagine what an opposed eviction would take. So you do need to assess the situation properly. You need to assess whether this occupier actually intends to oppose an application for eviction. And how do you do this? Well, I would normally suggest that you at least pay a little upfront fee and you allow the owner to institute an application for eviction, for example, and you see what sort of reaction you get from the occupier. If you get nothing, you know it's not going to be opposed, and maybe you can delay the transfer until you finish the eviction in the owner's name. If there's opposition, then you decide from there. Either take the transfer and do the eviction yourself, or do it in the owner's name. So just little litmus test to know how bad the situation is going to be if you were to take transfer.